When populations around the world are surveyed, they have ranked the United States as a greater threat to world peace and democracy than Russia or China. Much that is documented here has long been obvious to the victims of American aggression. They can only laugh when they hear US presidents speak of the country's commitment to humane values. But for those in the United States, it is critically important to see through American mythology about noble intent. It may seem obvious that the interests of dominant elite groups are more important to foreign policy than basic moral principles, and that American exceptionalism is a fiction. The critical fact is that it is a dangerous fiction. The myth of American idealism is used to excuse behavior that has caused colossal amounts of death and destruction. It has kept us from holding our war criminals to account. It now blinds many Americans to the ways in which their country's policies threaten the violent destruction of humankind itself.
The crazy thing is, Lenore, you just said that off the dome. That was just kind of in your head right there. So you just decided to drop that.
Once in a while, when the passion strikes me, when the spirit moves me, these things happen.
You're now listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome back to the Socialist Shelf. I am back from my hiatus. Thank you to Lenore and Ryan for holding it down. This week we have a guest. I'm really excited about this guest actually because I'm a fan of his work. I know a lot of our listeners probably are as well. We have Nathan J. Robinson, the editor of Current Affairs and writer of the book that we will be discussing. Welcome to the podcast, Nathan.
Hey, nice to be with you.
Yeah. So tell us, I mean, just at the top, you wrote this book with Noam Chomsky, which, definitely fellow who needs no introduction, of course, to our listeners. And you're telling folks about it. This is a very timely book, but could you give people just the overview of what this book is and why you wrote it?
Well, as you said, Noam Chomsky doesn't really need an introduction because he's the most cited intellectual in the world, I think, still, or living intellectual. He's a little bit behind like Plato and Marx, right? And so,
well, give him time to catch up.
Yeah, and at the core of Chomsky's, in addition to the pioneering work he did in linguistics, I think people understand that he has had a reputation for the last 60 years as one of the foremost, if not the foremost, I guess probably the foremost, critic of the United States foreign policy, right? And so when the United States has waged war around the world, one of the leading dissident voices against what our country has been doing has always been Noam Chomsky. And he's written prolifically. He's the author of, I don't even know if there's actually a full count of the number of books that he's published, because it kind of depends how you count. There's interview books, there's compilations of essays, but it's in the hundreds. And, but I mean, I think that his critique is so enduringly important. A lot of what he had done, though, was produce work that analyzed particular conflicts, right? So he had a lot of writing on the Vietnam War. He had a lot of writing on Central America in the 80s, on the Iraq War. And he, and I felt, we really need a good new Chomsky book updated for our time. This was in about 2021. And I thought it would be really nice if there was a kind of powerful statement that drew together a lot of what he'd been saying over the past 60 years and really explained what the point was in revisiting it. Like, why is his critique important? What is he trying to say? So I approached him because he was a subscriber to our magazine and said, I'd really like to work with you on something that updates, refreshes, and remakes the point for our particular moment for the 2020s.
That makes perfect sense. Yeah. And the book, just because in case I didn't say it at the top, it's The Myth of American Idealism. You know that from the title of the episode. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you talk about how he's written so many books. We just not too long ago had Vijay Prashad on. He just wrote on Cuba with
Yeah.
Chomsky. I guess our goal is to get every Chomsky co-author on the pod.
There's a lot.
But yeah, no, it's absolutely important for our current conditions. I mean, it needs no real enumeration of how many crimes the United States has committed and how relevant that is. But you really want to, if you're looking at it in totality, but it's important to get into specifics. And I also find that this book is interesting because it's accessible. It's not, sometimes it can be difficult to tell, okay, well, where do I even start? Go on a Wikipedia deep dive, go into, well, let's read about this operation, that operation, this war, that war. So it is important to have something that can you can sit down with and get into what's going on. I'm curious, why do you feel it, obviously you talked about Chomsky's work there. Why do you feel it constructive to enumerate American crimes? Why is that important for this moment?
Yeah. Often when people read Chomsky's work, they can come away going, my God, this is just a long list of horrible things America has done. And so what I wanted, and I feel like part of my contribution to this work is to really draw out, as I was saying before, okay, what is the point? What is the takeaway here? And one of the takeaways here has been that by studying these conflicts, we can see how the U.S. population has been lied to, has been deceived, the way that they've been tricked into thinking that things that are not in their own interest are in fact in their interest, the way that atrocities are disguised as acts of benevolence. And just to give you one really important way in which studying this is helpful, the book's Israel-Palestine chapter stops before October 7th, okay, because unfortunately Chomsky actually had a stroke during the end part of the production of this book, and that was before October 7th, right? So, but what we do in that chapter is we go through the entire history of the Israel-Palestine conflict up to about 2022. And we show all of the ways in which the United States, successive United States governments have presented themselves as being disinterested or interested in the peace process, facilitating the peace process, all the while taking actions that actually undermine peace by simply supporting Israel in its maximalist goals of maintaining total permanent control over the full land of Palestine. Now, if you study that history, if you understand that history, then you are prepared to see through what happened after October 7th, which was the Biden administration lying continuously and suggesting that it was interested in peace, that it was interested in negotiating a ceasefire, that it was interested in Palestinian human rights. And you can tell that is not at all, that what always happens is United States governments portray themselves as disinterested, but their actual policy has always been, and was under Biden as well, full military and financial support for Israel, no matter what.
Yeah, it's a position of feigned disinterest, as you say, while supporting, of course, the occupying side. Of course, it's consistent with a duplicity in the presentation of American foreign policy. You have a quote here in the introduction from Ambassador Charles Bolin from an address in 1969. Our policy is not rooted in any national material interest, as most foreign policies of other countries in the past have been. A very novel thing to assume that a state doesn't act in its own interests. But that's the thing. Like,
we're the only one ever.
Mm-hmm. The only one, yes, unique among the, American exceptionalism manifests in so many ways, which, tell it to the CIA, right, which openly admits on its podcast that its goal as an organization is to assist American capital penetration into foreign markets, right?
CIA, come on the pod.
Incidentally, that address was at Columbia University, very timely. But that's the crux, rhetorically speaking, right, of this American intransigence, of the American bearing in conflicts like Israel-Palestine. The language our leaders use, we notice, and that you all very expertly lay out here, to express their actions on the world stage, at least to the public, is fundamentally moralistic, right? You have national interests, you have long-term geopolitical goals. If you're negotiating on those grounds, fine, you can negotiate. You can't negotiate on things like freedom, on things like democracy. They're very nebulous concepts that the United States arrogates to itself the ability to define.
Although an important point here is that this is kind of true up until Trump's second term, because one of the things you notice about Trump's second term is that a lot of what we're talking about in the book, which is this bipartisan moralistic language that suggests that the United States doesn't just do what other countries do and narrowly pursue its own self-interest. It's actually pursuing the interests of humanity and the world benevolently. Trump kind of abandons this stuff. He abandons the hypocrisy and just goes, no, we're going to do whatever's in America's self-interest. I am a gangster. In fact, he posted, we accuse the American state of operating like the mafia. Well, Trump posted an AI generated picture of him as the Godfather.
Yeah.
So it's like the pretense is dropped. And it used to be that the argument for invading a country was we're trying to help the people of Iraq by invading Iraq. Well, that's not what Trump really, he sort of a little bit argues it about Greenland. He says it's going to be good for the people of Greenland. But mainly, he openly says, we want Greenland, so we should have it because we're America.
Yes, same with the Panama Canal. It's, I was just listening to the socialist program, Brian Becker, and he was talking about it's a cowboy. He says it's like a cowboy colonialism. It's like a throwback almost to the pre-World War II order. And I also think it's interesting that a lot of the criticisms of Trump you see from the more establishment, blob, liberal types is that he is messing up this particular thing. Something that we see at, to be clear, very laudable, great mass protests against Trump is sometimes you see signs like hands off NATO and things like that, which I think people have good intentions, but it's interesting to see that liberal establishment asserting itself in that way.
I'm so glad you said that because, Jacob, one of the dangers in the opposition to Trump is that it can amount to a demand for a return to hypocrisy, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want the ugly U.S. foreign policy. We want the fake benevolent U.S. foreign policy, again, where we pretend that we're trying to help Ukraine, right? Trump doesn't pretend he's trying to help Ukraine. Biden pretended Biden pretended he was trying to help Ukraine, right? He's actually just trying to undermine a geopolitical adversary. He doesn't give a shit about whether the people of Ukraine are dying en masse. In fact, that's considered kind of a plus, right? Oh, the Ukrainians are dying so that we don't have to. And in fact, U.S. politicians spoke of the Ukraine war as like a great bargain.
Fighting to the last Ukrainian, yeah.
Right. So you got to be careful that post-Trump, if there is a post-Trump, that we don't everyone doesn't celebrate the return to this era of, we've got our moral foreign policy back, when what we actually have, as Chomsky and I kind of show in this book, is, the policy that pretends to be moral while doing a lot of the same things that Trump does. In fact, one of the things we document in this book is the continuity between Obama foreign policy, Trump term one foreign policy, and Biden foreign policy.
100%. Yeah, you cannot understand, of course, the genocide ongoing in Gaza, Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the proxy war there. You can't understand this current geopolitical moment without understanding that continuity. The fact of Obama being confronted with, as you say, a mountain of evidence for Bush's perfidy, for his violation of international law, for his program of torture. The fact of Obama being confronted with that and choosing to look forward, right, to not prosecute any, let alone Bush himself, any official from his administration for these high crimes. The fact of that establishes a precedent of impunity that goes far beyond Trump's simple lawlessness, because as is laid out late in the book, based on Chomsky's correct contention that all U.S. presidents after World War II, if Nuremberg were applied consistently, would be in prison for war crimes right now. As that illustrates, the lawless president is not a new thing.
No, that's so important, right? It's the pretense that has been dropped. The lawlessness has been consistent. This book really is. I understand we've had some feedback from people like this is very wearying, right? This compilation of crimes. But when Chomsky says something like that, every post-war president, is a war criminal. It's fair to say, well, that's a very extreme statement. Can you back that up? And so it's a very important we think, to actually back that up, to show that we really are talking about what you said there, which is a culture of complete impunity for some of the worst atrocities of the back half of the 20th century and the greatest crime still of the 21st century, which is the invasion of Iraq. I mean, the fact that there was no accountability whatsoever totally erodes any moral standing that we have to condemn Putin's war against Ukraine, because we can't even prosecute, and are not even interested in a discussion of prosecuting our own war criminals, our own aggressors.
Precisely.
Yeah, I mean, you have George W. Bush going on stage talking to donors and accidentally flubbing Iraq for Ukraine, and then just shrugging it off
what a
like
line
it's a
that
joke.
Was. Yes,
you know,
he has that incredible line where he says, like, one man's completely illegal invasion of Iraq. I mean, Ukraine.
Yeah, I know that Biden accidentally calling Zelensky Putin got a lot of attention, but I thought that one was a more interesting.
It's a more poignant Freudian slip.
Yes, no doubt, no doubt. I find it interesting because, we talk about all these presidents violate the Geneva Conventions as per the actual rules set up in the Geneva Conventions, and you have a long list as to why. I thought, maybe give you the opportunity here. Is there any, I think a lot of people know about some of the broader interventions that are happening in different places. People know something about the Vietnam War. People know something about Iraq. At least I sure hope they would. There are smaller ones, though, that people don't know as much about that are sometimes connected to these larger ones. I wonder if you wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about maybe anything that you think is a under-discussed thing that you're able to get into this book. You can
well, I mean, I would say even on those major conflicts, my response would be, yeah, you know something, but you don't know the half of it. I think when you start reading this book, and when you start finding out what actually happened to the Vietnamese during the Vietnam War, I mean, just how heinous the U.S. use of massive firepower against civilians and and chemical weapons was. And then there's the bombing of Laos next door, which, I mean, that's a really under-discussed one. That's one what I think is really crazy, because it was the most bombed country in the world since World War II because of U.S. bombs. Okay, so in fact, it might even have exceeded any country being bombed in World War II. It just extraordinary level of firepower deployed against a poor country. And you'd think that would be like a major historical event. It's not even mentioned in textbook histories of the Vietnam War. I mean, they'll mention the bombing of Cambodia, but Laos, where children are still dying from encountering unexploded U.S. bombs and having their faces blown off in Laos in the 21st century. And, and this just isn't taught in our history, even though this is like one of the biggest military campaigns we ever had, and it's just erased from the history textbooks. That is wild. Yeah. And so we're often discussing major conflicts that people know about, but we're discussing the unknown aspects of them. So we go a lot into the war in Afghanistan, for instance, and we explain just how corrupt and unpopular the government that we were supporting there was, while we were, again, using all this wonderful highfalutin rhetoric about how much we wanted to bring them democracy. And then after we pulled out, we immediately began to starve the people of Afghanistan by stealing all of their money. And then there are other things. There are just these Cold War interventions that there's a whole part I don't actually remember much about because it was a couple of years ago when we wrote this, but I remember the overthrow of the government of British Guiana was really interesting. There's the invasion of Panama, which we begin the international law chapter.
Hopefully, we don't start calling that the first invasion of Panama.
The first
at the time of this listening, that's looking increasingly likely.
Mm-hmm. In particular, structurally, right? You have that first part of the book that chronicles these interventions, these coups, these invasions. Both remembered and ill-remembered. In fact, deliberately hidden in the case of Laos, as you mentioned. You have that as the first part, and you have sort of how it's sold to the public and on the international stage. In part two. And to somebody who is familiar with the history of U.S. empire and its flouting of international law, perhaps, as we said, the litany of crimes, particularly in the first 8 chapters, is like, okay, well, why is this being brought up? And the answer, of course, is, it's very well answered by that second part, because of the massive propaganda effort that the U.S. ruling class goes on to sell these things, to hide these things. Of course, you have Laos as a precedent for what's going on today with Yemen, a war that's even today, with Yemen's primacy in the ongoing Palestine conflict, is an under-discussed front, certainly, compared to the scale of famine and conflict wielded against it. So that's our answer. Is that this thing doesn't have nearly the this history doesn't have nearly the exposure that it ought to.
Right. It doesn't, and it's important to understand the history in order to understand the threats that we face in our own time, right? We have this chapter on the nuclear proliferation and climate catastrophe and the U.S. role in both of those. And those are the leading threats to the future of humankind, right? The possibility of a U.S. war with Russia or China, the destruction of the Earth through the runaway climate catastrophe. And we have a major role in the spread of nuclear weapons and in causing the climate crisis and preventing a global solution to the climate crisis. We also have a major role in undermining international law and international institutions, right? So in the post-war era, it was widely understood around the world that you couldn't have what you had after World War I, where they tried to found the League of Nations and it all fell apart, in part because the United States wouldn't join it. You needed a global government of some kind to ensure that conflicts were resolved peacefully, because in the era of nuclear weapons, if conflicts weren't resolved peacefully, it could lead to catastrophes for all of humanity, right? And so we have the United Nations, but the United States has consistently undermined and kept the United Nations weak and kept international law weak by carving out exceptions for itself that undermine the moral legitimacy of these international institutions that are so important if we are going to avoid a war of all against all in the nuclear era.
Exactly. You have, of course, the undermining of the International Criminal Court by not subscribing to it, of course,
right.
Despite our demands that, Putin be hauled before it. You have our, consistent refusal to sign, the treaties such as the Law of the Sea, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, all these other things that that there's an understanding internationally that yes, countries have to be bound by certain rules of conduct, and no, that's not the way that our ruling class has worked. The small elite, primarily business interests that indeed dominate it. Whence, of course, the dangerous fiction of American exceptionalism. Not just that there's a discrepancy between what's said and what's done, but that, you're absolutely right, Nathan, it threatens the world stability, it threatens the human race, and it does the very things that we set out to prevent. I'm thinking of entrenching the Taliban as a governing force in Afghanistan, right?
The Taliban example is so good because there is a case where, in fact, what is not widely understood is the Taliban might not be in power today if the United States had not invaded Afghanistan. Now, we think of us as going to Afghanistan, overthrowing the Taliban, liberating Afghanistan, and then, we eventually give up and pull out and the Taliban come back. But what we show is actually the United States undermined the legitimacy of anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan, right? That might have, we don't know, that the Taliban was actually quite unpopular with the population. But we, in fact, managed to engineer a situation where the Taliban became more popular because they were the resistance to U.S. occupation and a U.S. puppet government. And so we turned the Taliban into freedom fighters instead of the unpopular, hated theocratic government that they were in 2001.
I've quoted it on the show before, but I have a fellow I know who was deployed, I think twice in Afghanistan. And he said to me one night while quite drunk, we found the only motherfuckers there worse than the Taliban and sided with them. That's his words,
No, that's true, though. In this chapter, people don't know the story. I mean, they don't know that the guy we put in as vice president of Afghanistan, raped his political opponents.
Yeah.
Like horrible stuff. Like, just, he was so bad that the Obama administration had to ban him. The vice president of Afghanistan that they were supporting had to ban him from coming to America because he was such an embarrassment, and they didn't want to be seen with their vice president of Afghanistan.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And as well, in a million smaller ways too. It's not touched on in the book, but you have the you have door-to-door vaccination campaigns that are false, that are actually efforts to look for Osama bin Laden, that end up turning people off to public health initiatives in Afghanistan. Of course, the thing you do mention, re-vaccines, is our deliberate spreading of misinformation related to China's COVID vaccine, which
that was a crazy one.
Yeah,
If you could speak to that, actually, I think that's extremely relevant. And as someone who currently has a mild COVID case, COVID is on the brain. So if you could talk about that, that'd be great.
Yeah, and I'm in fact getting over my own case of COVID, because it turns out that the pandemic isn't over, even though we've been told repeatedly that the pandemic was over. I mean, that was a really ugly incident in which the United States actually tried to, spread doubt about China's COVID vaccine, in order to undermine China, right? Because one of the themes of the book is that we are willing to do very sordid, deeply ugly and amoral things in order to win this kind of geopolitical chess game with our adversaries. And that and that goes from everything from, doesn't matter if people die of COVID because they were vaccine hesitant because we told them China's vaccine didn't work, to, we don't care how many people die in Ukraine. Just these really, really ugly things that are, or we don't mind if if the entire nation of Vietnam and all of the surrounding countries are destroyed for millions of people die, as long as we maintain the U.S. position in the world. I mean, these are such ugly things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And the what's unclear, what is still being sussed out, of course, is the path for activists at home, the path forward to curtail this sort of this sort of recklessness on the part of the U.S. ruling class. Of course, the bit from the preface that I quite like is this book is not only an attempt to set the record straight, it's a plea for mass action by someone approaching the end of his own lifetime of activism. And it's something that Chomsky touches on later in the book, that y'all both touch on, that mass action brought the United States. We talked about this in our Jonathan Melrod Fighting Times episode, right? The United States was much closer to a considerable national upheaval during the Vietnam War than a lot of people are aware, and that's something that sort of gets memory hold as well. And that's and it's that influenced our decision ultimately to pull back from that front.
Well, I mean, Chomsky often points out that I think during the Nixon administration, they were talking about how they couldn't send more troops to Vietnam because they would probably need them to quell unrest at home as the war became more and more unpopular. But yes, I mean, the book isn't just a bleak record of everything that the United States has done wrong, and it isn't just a warning about all of the terrible things that are probably going to happen in the future, but it is also an exhortation that draws on the history of inspiring activist movements on the left who have consistently opposed the actions of the United States government, from Eugene Debs getting thrown into jail for opposing World War I, to all of the heroic activists during the Vietnam War, to all of the heroic activists around the Iraq War, to people like Chelsea Manning, who went to prison, was thrown into solitary confinement for exposing war crimes in Iraq. There's this long history in this country of Americans that we can be proud of, which is another reason why it is a mistake to call Chomsky anti-American, because one of the things that we do is that we celebrate all of the ways in which great Americans have seen what their government, what the state was doing, and been totally repulsed by it.
I find it interesting. We like to look at history and basically act like, oh, that's what people were doing then, and now we know what's wrong now. When quite often during history, there are a lot of dissenting voices on this topic and other ones. I mean, you can go back as far as, talking about slavery in the United States. And there were plenty of people talking about it.
Yeah.
And the people who owned slaves often used slavery as an analogy of like the worst thing that could possibly happen. You have people writing Declaration of Independence that are like, what are we, slaves to England? You know, that kind of
well, I think you might know it's wrong then, mightn't you, if you're going to use it that way?
Yeah, it's as far back as the 1770s. You have Samuel Johnson going, okay, well, why is this American plantocracy making pay-ins to liberty when, you know, they themselves own slaves?
Yeah. Hypocrisy much?
Yeah, this is interesting that this is an ongoing thing and this dissent happens, and at times it is quite effective and or medium level of effectiveness. Sometimes it's more, sometimes it's less. I'm interested because, of course, you know, you were talking about writing the book in a certain era and not being able to, you know, of course, history continues to move after the book is finished and sent to print. We've seen a significant, you know, there's been ups and downs in it, but a movement right now specifically around Palestine.
Right.
There are the encampments that happened at student universities last year. There's been, you know, several mass marches on DC, one that was as many as 500,000 people. You had the Red Line March that surrounded the White House with a giant red banner. You've had some really significant stuff. I mean, you had a serviceman set himself on fire, Aaron Bushnell. We don't talk about it, but that happened just a year ago. I'm interested in your thoughts on, you know, taking this knowledge and the knowledge of our conditions. And I think what are some effective ways we can build a mass movement and fight back against that from history? And one more point on that also, what are your thoughts regarding the fact that, like, because of this proliferation of technology and the ability to see this, it awakens that many Americans, even though, you know, a lot of these actions are the type of things that have gone on for a long time.
Yeah, as you say, and as I mentioned, you know, the destruction of Gaza unfolded after we finished. Well, I wrote a little postscript in that chapter about, you know, kind of the first 6 months of the destruction of Gaza, and what you've seen there is precisely what we're talking about: Americans who see what is going on, see that their country is complicit, and are horrified, and they resolve to act. And you might look at the Palestine protests as a story of the ineffectualness of movements, because, of course, as much as we've had all of these encampments, all of the actions that you describe, it hasn't succeeded at slowing down or stopping the destruction of Gaza. In fact, the Israeli government just announced, Israel's Security Council just resolved that they plan to flatten every last building that still remains standing in Gaza. So completing the process of the destruction of Gaza. So you might say, well, the movement has not been effective. I would put a hypothetical, which is, what if the Palestine movement had been 3 times as large? What if it had been 6 times as large, 10 times as large? At a certain point, it would paralyze the country. Right. And they would have to change course. The Palestine movement did not become powerful enough, but it certainly became a threat, because they are scared of the Palestine movement, because that's why that's why they are cracking down on it. You don't crack down if it's meaningless, if it doesn't matter, you know, to anything, whether these students go out and protest. There wouldn't be so much effort to repress it, and the efforts to repress it are indeed extreme, you know, expulsions and suspensions, deportations, arrests, you know, branding people anti-Semites, trying to get them, blacklisted forever in their careers, and all of that is an effort to make sure this movement doesn't grow large enough to where it can force the U.S. state to change course. But we know that the movement probably, the movement is probably why Kamala Harris didn't ultimately succeed in defeating Donald Trump, right? Because she refused to meet with the families from Gaza. She refused to make any concessions or to promise a break from Biden's foreign policy. So, as with Hubert Humphrey in 1968, she went down to defeat because she tied herself to this unpopular war. Now, of course, the end result of that is that Donald Trump comes in. His policy is much, much worse. But the point is, the movement does, in fact, pose a threat, and it needs to pose a larger threat. And if it poses a large enough threat, then you will see even someone like Donald Trump will have to move, because in what is kind of a democracy, the United States is a full democracy, but it has democratic mechanisms. The state does have to respond to popular discontent past a certain point, because we can throw them out of office.
Right. And even full dictatorships historically with no elections have to at some point resolve or crack completely. That's
right.
You know, So absolutely, we agree, and of course, on the show, encourage mass action organizing. What I'd ask is, of course, we've most of us, I would say, a lot of us who are interested in these things, read Manufacturing Consent. That was written in 1988, I believe.
Mhm.
So that's it's been a long time. A lot of that holds true, but things have evolved. So to keep the American populace and, of course, the populace of other countries in line, to keep that myth of American idealism, or just to keep people from acting. What would you say? And you can talk about the elements that the book talks about here as well. What would you say is kind of the U.S. government's strategy around that, of maintaining that U.S. idealism, and what's evolved since Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent?
Well,
This one.
I mean, I don't know that there is much of a consistent and clear strategy here. As I've mentioned, the current administration has really kind of abandoned all attempts to appeal to American idealism, and instead, Elon Musk said he was putting USAID in the wood chipper, right? We're not
Yeah.
going to help these foreigners anymore. Forget vaccinating people in sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the strategies is to pivot to, well, okay, if you don't believe the myth, how about we just tell you to be your worst self? How about we just embrace selfishness and say that the American spirit is, it's a dog eat dog world, it's a social Darwinist world. Your job is to take as much as you can for yourself, and so that's the kind of Trumpian story, which is, no, we're not idealistic, we're realistic. We understand the way the world works, and you shouldn't have to feel bad about your country being an empire. And I think that's partly come about because the myth has been shattered, right? Because it became harder and harder for someone like Joe Biden to maintain the idea that he cared at all about Palestinians, because people could see that US policy was murdering Palestinians by the tens of thousands. And yet he was still mouthing these same platitudes about, how committed to peace we are, how much we want a ceasefire, how much we regret and lament all the death. Well, who believes that, right? The right doesn't believe it. The left doesn't believe it. No one in the center really believes it. And so I think one of the things that is starting to change is that people are becoming more cynical than they were when Chomsky wrote Manufacturing Consent. A lot of times when you tell people the basic thesis of Manufacturing Consent now, instead of it being controversial, they go, yeah, of course that's how it operates.
Right.
But Chomsky's work has kind of become conventional wisdom. There was a review. We got a review of this book in Foreign Policy magazine. Okay, Foreign Policy being the bastion of the foreign policy intellectual establishment in this country. The people who would never mention Chomsky, who would never review a book of his, who would never publish him, because they maintain all of the myths that we're talking about. Their review of this book was called "Noam Chomsky Has Been Proven Right." And they were just like, oh yeah, everything in this book is of course true. Right? And you go, what? They didn't discuss the fact that they spent the entire life of their magazine arguing the exact opposite. So one thing that has changed is that a lot of what we say in this book, people aren't going to be surprised by in a way that they might have been surprised in an era where the myth kind of had more cachet.
Yeah, it's very much a, there is, of course, the myth making that at times, and up against the reality of what we're seeing, particularly with this being the first live stream genocide in Palestine. Up against that, the myth making itself may seem particularly brazen. So a retreat to that open hard power, that cowboy diplomacy, as we've talked about, that in itself is just that brazenness shifting form. But again, there is a certain brazenness in itself to making that kind of retreat without acknowledging, as you say, Nathan, that you spent your entire career at a place like Foreign Policy saying the opposite, right? It's very much the thing of New York Times saying, "Oh, will Trump not pull back in his attacks on the trans community?" Meanwhile, the New York Times has spent years and years and years platforming anti-trans bigotry.
Yes.
That sort of thing. There's never, in the same way that there's never an accountability for the crimes of this or that administration. There's never an accountability for the lies told in mainstream media to run cover for them.
Well, look at Bill Kristol, who just rebranded himself after pushing the disastrous Iraq War, and now he's like a resistance Democrat, and nobody ever goes like, like, okay, but what about all of those people that you killed, essentially?
Yeah.
Like, or David Brooks just published this column in the New York Times that was like, oh yeah, Bernie Sanders was of course right about everything. Now, I spent years and years saying like Bernie is a crazy lefty Marxist, Leninist, communist who would destroy the country. Now I admit actually he was right about everything and he was the only way we had to stop Trump. Oops.
And you're supposed to just like hug and make up with these people and be
I
like,
guess.
yeah, great, we're going to let you keep running the show.
Yeah, and indeed, it's a very important critical eye on, in the furor of, in particular after 9/11, in the furor of building up the consensus for the invasion of Iraq, you have a very important, in this book, a very important critical eye on the sheer bloodthirst that infests, these pages and headlines of mainstream media. You say outright, this is one of my favorite sentences in the book, you talk about the crazed fantasies of Thomas Friedman, right? Who's openly called for war crimes in the former Yugoslavia and elsewhere. There's a certain acceptance that newspapers of record, media of record in the United States are allowed to call for things that, merely calling for them would get other countries condemned as rogue states.
Yeah.
And in particular, they don't even need to be pushed by the government to do this. People, the people in charge just are, the sort of people who would.
Well, I mean, one of the things we point out is that the United Nations Charter bans not only the use of force, but the threat to use force against another country. And yet U.S. presidents consistently threaten to use force, and it's not just Donald Trump. It's also, presidents like Barack Obama who say with regard to Iran that all options are on the table, right? Including, going to war, presumably. Like that's a threat, which is we might actually invade you. Now we prefer to negotiate, but we're threatening to invade you. And that's been consistent. And in the media, as you say, you get away with these things like, there's op-eds in the New York Times that say bomb North Korea before it's too late. Oh, bomb Iran. Thomas Friedman saying, we need to take Serbia back to the 13th century, or we need to tell the Iraqis to, his famous quote on Charlie Rose was suck on this, being U.S. military power. So it's really when you start to step back and try and see your culture and your politics from the outside, and you try and see it as the victims see it. I mean, one of our efforts here is to try and show these things through the eyes of the victims of U.S. foreign policy. You see that so much of it seems sick and monstrous.
Yeah, it's the sort of environment, and I was back and forth on how much this really shapes the prosecution of U.S. foreign policy and war making. Certainly you have personal animus at the highest levels. Johnson's commitment to Vietnam escalation, Bush's commitment to literally bringing about the end times in Christian eschatology.
Gog and Magog, all that.
Yeah, Biden's personal Zionism, of course. If there weren't Israel, we'd have to invent one. Certainly you have personal animus guiding these sorts of efforts. But again, it's the sort of thing that can only flourish in such a system as ours, which facilitates the defense, the promulgation of U.S. motives for imperialism and war making, which are almost uniformly guided by private interests.
Yeah. I mean, one of the kind of puzzles that I don't think we resolved that well in this book, because I think it's really hard to resolve, is the question of why. What is going on in the minds of policymakers that are leading to these horrendous decisions? You can have a kind of socialist, kind of Marxist explanation of U.S. foreign policy that works reasonably well. But as you pointed out there, Lenore, there's a psychological component too. Lyndon Johnson was once asked by a journalist, why are we in Vietnam? And according to the story, which I asked a Vietnam historian about because I was so dubious about the sourcing of this story, and I was like, is this legit? And the historian, Christian Api, said it is, as far as we know, legit, is that he was asked why we were in Vietnam. Lyndon Johnson unzipped his pants, took out his penis, showed it to the reporter, and said, this is why. This is why we're in Vietnam. Now, that suggests that toxic masculinity is
Right.
there's a component of U.S. foreign policy that is not just business interests, but is something deeply warped about American men, and the American male psyche might have something to do with it. And so whether George Bush's perceived inadequacies about, or his desire to impress his father as the ne'er-do-well son had something to do with the invasion of Iraq, I don't think we could ever really get to the bottom of that. And that was actually one of the frustrations of this book, was like, if you want a clear answer to the question, why did we invade Iraq? Like, we can point out all of the lies, we can point out all of the ways in which the invasion was thought to consolidate U.S. power in the region. But ultimately, there are lots of different motivations at work here.
Somewhere there's an alternate timeline where George Bush didn't mismanage the Texas Rangers and Iraq is flourishing today.
We didn't read the Left Behind series. We talked about it in our Left Behind episode, but he literally referred to that fucking book series when he was talking to the president of France at one point. Crazy stuff. But one thing I want to ask is, and you're talking about, this inability to know for sure the basis of a lot of this stuff. We know the systems, of course. We know the private interests. We know why the U.S. has its primacy, all of that. But sometimes the specifics can be hard to track. We don't know specifically what's going to happen. There's a lot of subjectivity, especially when you have individuals invested with a lot of power at the top of systems. So, of course, it's a difficult question to ask. But where do you see, with the world order the way it is, with sort of multipolarity emerging, or we could say fully emerged, where do you see all of this going? Because you talked about how Trump is kind of putting the lie to this stuff and the liberal opposition is mostly just arguing to return. So without asking you to have a crystal ball here or to tell us what's going to happen next, where do you sort of, with your analysis, see the trends headed?
Well, we're in a very dangerous moment because a power like the United States that is seeing its power eroded is very, very dangerous, because we may lash out. I mean, I think it's partly explains the war in Ukraine, is that Putin saw Russia's power eroding, saw the encroachment of NATO, and was determined to take, a bold step to try and make sure that Ukraine didn't slip into the Western orbit. And I think that the United States has done similar things, right? I mean, the Vietnam War was a case where we knew that the government that we were backing in South Vietnam was unpopular, that it couldn't be maintained. So we were willing to basically destroy the country in order to try and do the impossible, which is to maintain that government in power. In the age of nuclear weapons, I mean, we may see future wars as the United States sees, for example, the rise of China, right? As China decides that it doesn't want the United States to be a power in the Pacific, right? That it believes that China should be the hegemonic power in its own backyard. And the United States refuses to accede to that reality. I think we may see the potential for a catastrophic war. I mean, as climate change worsens, and something like taking over Greenland begins to seem like a great bet for improving the United States. So I think we might well see Trump, or subsequent president like Trump, lashing out against, in a desperate attempt to preserve U.S. power and a refusal to acknowledge the reality. I mean, a lot of what we discuss in the book is the refusal of U.S. leaders who live in these fantasy worlds of their own creation to acknowledge that no, you can't. You're not going to succeed in your effort to make the Iraqis like you by staging a brutal occupation. You're not going to succeed in getting the Palestinians to just stop resisting. They're not going to do that. They're going to continue. You can't defeat them. You can't defeat the Viet Cong. What you can do is a genocide, right? The only way to win is to just kill everyone. If you kill everyone, then you can stop the Palestinian resistance. But if you pursue the tactic of violence, you're just going to create more and more resistance, more and more conflict that is ongoing, that threatens to spiral out of control. So I'm very, very worried. And one of the reasons for this book existing is it comes out of the worry that Chomsky and I shared about the 5, 10, 20-year future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's super important that as we go into this 5, 10, 20-year future, those of us who have an interest in social justice, have an interest in being in a livable planet, have an interest in, not dying in the South Pacific for a war that none of us really care about or have material and stakes in the game.
Slaughtered on the front lines of the Battle of Calgary or something.
Right, exactly. Like, I think it's important to read books like this and to study, to understand how this stuff has happened in the past, and to sort of have our ears and eyes open to understand whatever reasons or justifications are going to come down the pipe. Maybe you have just Trump just straight up saying, we're here for the oil or we're here for the lithium or whatever. Maybe you have
Which
that.
he literally did say in the case of Venezuela.
True. But maybe you have, the next Democrat president, or maybe you have, whatever media apparatus is trying to launder imperialist war. And it's important for those of us who would resist that, because I think the popular opposition inside the United States is so critical to limiting these things, which you show. We have to have these in our heads, this information in our heads before the moment of crisis, right? We can't at the moment of crisis necessarily figure out how empire works. We've got to kind of know it ahead of time.
That's right.
Lenore, is there anything else specific you want to get into? If not, I'll kind of get into a last question here.
Well, I would just say that the urgency of the situation, I think, is more of a I don't know if symptom is the right word, but the unpredictability of an empire losing its primacy, moving into a multipolar world from the unipolar one which formerly it dominated, it is certainly of a piece with the overwhelming force with which the United States responds to, threats to its power, even when it's at its peak. The threat of a good example y'all bring up, the domino theory, rather than being about the spread of communism or whatever other ideology, is more about the idea that, a much smaller country can use its resources for national development, can engage in, its form of nationalism independent of a U.S. system, or within one certainly that challenges it. And even down to students organizing protests in Argentina to keep subsidized bus fare, you see incredible violence and murder wielded against such formations. So as we move into the more threatening, into the more unpredictable phase of this declining U.S. empire, it's important to point out to people, look, this has always been fundamentally violent, and marshaling forces against it has never been more important, because were it not for the obfuscation, were it not for the propaganda campaign, of course, these things have always been opposed even in their own time, and they can be struggled against and fought back against. No manifestation of empire is too small for the people to fight back against, because no manifestation of resistance was too small for the empire to crush.
No doubt. Nathan, we really appreciate you coming on, and really like to talk. We really like this talk about the Myth of American Idealism. Again, really encourage everyone to get the book. The last thing I'll ask you before we hop off here is, our podcast, we typically talk about fiction. Are you a fiction reader at all? And is there any?
I wish. I mean, I just don't get much time for fiction. The sad reality of my life is that my reading habits are just not what I wish they were. I read so many, like the last book I read was Douglas Murray's horrible book about the Israel-Palestine conflict.
Oh, yeah.
Right, because I had to debunk it, and I just wrote an article about it that I published yesterday.
Sure.
So I read a lot of propaganda that I have to trash.
Yeah. But I'm gonna say, is there been any fiction you've read recently, or any time recent times at all, that you might recommend to people, or any books for this type of
Ryan just noted, it's a type of fiction.
It is a type of fiction. Any recommendations you want to throw out to our
Gosh,
listeners?
I don't
That's
think
something
I
I
can
like to
give
do
fiction
when
recommendations because I just haven't been able to read fiction in the last
I got you.
year.
We can cut this
But
part.
no,
No worries.
point is actually good, which is let me do something a little different with that question.
Okay.
Which is to say that I actually think that the fictions that we're talking about, the myths that we're talking about, a lot of people on our side don't read the trash. I read the trash because I want to understand how it works. And one of the things I learned over the course of writing this book was you have to read the propaganda. You have to understand the propaganda. You have to get inside it. One of the reasons that I read Douglas Murray's piece of trash book is because I want to understand how these myths take people in. And so I would recommend that, I always recommend that people on the left like examine liberal and right-wing books to see what the other side is being told. So those qualify as fiction. So find the worst pieces of propaganda you can and analyze them, because it'll train you to be a better critical thinker.
Yes, look.
That's a fascinating segue because we are actually talking next week about abundance by Ezra Klein.
Yes, so study Ezra Klein's book to understand, why is it a New York Times bestseller? What is it about this thing that is so compelling to people?
Yes, no doubt. Well, we really appreciate you, Nathan. Once again, the book is The Myth of American Idealism, and I will also recommend people subscribe to Current Affairs.
Thank you. Yes,
It's great.
Current Affairs Magazine,
Really good stuff.
currentaffairs.org.
So, yep, really appreciate you. And Lenore, you got anything else? Anything to close us out on?
I mean, look forward to abundance. Certainly, look forward to in the same way that we looked forward to perhaps the president is missing. Even in fiction, that did cross my mind. Because even in fiction, there is that conception of the U.S. as a, though flawed, benevolent force. So, in fiction or nonfiction, across multiple fronts of propaganda, once you see how these narratives are spun, you really can't unsee them.
Yeah,
And,
right.
perhaps there's a really fun and interesting podcast out there that kind of breaks it down. So, keep your eye out for that. Keep your eye out for books like Myth of American Idealism. Greatly enjoyed it, Nathan. It's a great correlation of all the of all the contents of our sordid history, but also a call for action, because action is indeed possible, historically has been, will happen again.
Action is indeed possible. Y'all have a good one.
Peace out.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.